Woo!
Today, Temple Bar, one of Dublin's most well-known areas, is a very vibrant and lively place at night. But it wasn't always like that. In Victorian times, these streets were almost deserted, frequented only by ladies of the night. And the young policemen who patrolled these streets had a very difficult job to do. Known as Johnny Raws, these young rookies were kept away from the main thoroughfares where they might meet members of the quality. Dublin in those days had between 50 to 60 days of fog each winter. Mail vans could get lost on their way to the GPO. People could stumble into the canals. It had just been a few months since the failed Fenian Rising of 1867, which ended quite badly. Afterwards, there were hundreds of Irish Americans still in Dublin. They'd come over for the Rising of the Moon, but they weren't able to get back to the States, and they were very conspicuous. They stood on street corners in their square-toed boots and slouch hats. So Dublin was a very dangerous place in these times for a young police officer. It was into this pea soup that a young constable called Patrick Keenan from Mullingar walked on the morning of 31st of October 1867. Putting his back to City Hall, he walked towards Wellington Quay, and he stood for a moment, taking in the scene. As Keenan stood, he could make out the dark shadow of a man on Essex Bridge. He decided that this man was a little bit suspicious. If you remember, the area was deserted. He crossed over onto Wellington Quay. Keenan followed him. As they passed Scott and Bell, the silk merchants, the light of a gas lamp gave Keenan a glimpse of a lightish coloured bundle under the man's arm. Thinking that he was a thief or he was about to commit a robbery, he challenged him. "Stop," he said. The man didn't stop. He took a step forward. Keenan went to grab him. In a sudden, the man turned around, the ends of his jerry coat wishing against Keenan's tunic. There was a sudden flash and a sulphurous smell of smoke. Not realising he had been shot, Keenan staggered on the quay. There was a young constable called Hickey who at that moment had been patrolling near Parliament Street. He came rushing back down with a cabman who had been at the Dolphin Hotel. Keenan stumbled into their arms. "I'm shot," Keenan cried. "Bring me a priest." At the same time, a sergeant called Stephen Kelly was on the beat. He was just going around to inspect the men. A more seasoned officer, he'd been in the force for several years. As soon as he heard the gunshot, he ran through Merchant's Arch, down towards the direction of Halfpenny Bridge, where he met a policeman called Morton. You can imagine the figure that it must have cut as the two of them dashed back up the quay to see what had happened. Now, Kelly wasn't as fit as Morton, and that proved to be his undoing. As they reached the corner of Eustace Street, Kelly had to stop for a moment. He felt, as he said afterwards, thoroughly blown. He walked up to the junction of Eustace Street and Essex Street, where he met a prostitute called Mary Donnelly. And as they stood talking, the dark shadow of a man emerged from under one of the gas lamps. "Stand back," the gunman said. Kelly took a step forward. Without hesitating, the gunman fired. Kelly dropped onto the cobbles, shot in the chest. Within minutes, the scene was thronged by street urchins in their bare feet, prostitutes, and other police officers who had come to see what the commotion was. One of the more resourceful policemen ran up towards Dame Street, where he grabbed a cabman, seized the reins, and instructed him to go back down to the corner to take Kelly to Mercer's Hospital. By then, they'd also put Keenan onto the cart. In those days, a journey to hospital over cobblestone streets with an abdominal injury must have been excruciating for the two officers. The doors of Mercer's Hospital burst open to receive them. To make a long story short, Keenan didn't survive his injuries. 8 days later, he died in agony in Mercer's Hospital. His funeral cortege was so large that as the bottom was coming over Carlisle or Connell Bridge, the top was only turning into what's now Parnell Street. Kelly, meanwhile, languished in hospital, but started to show signs of recovery. Now, you must remember in those days, without access to radiology equipment or laboratory equipment, it was extremely hard to treat somebody for a gunshot injury. Instead, surgeons had to feel for the bullet by touch, which was exactly what happened in Kelly's case. Over several days, Surgeon Richard Butcher came to visit the man and felt that the ball was lodged in between his ribs. He decided he would attempt an operation, but crucially, there was no anaesthetic for Kelly. He was held down by 2 orderlies, given a dose of brandy, and as the surgeon made the first cut, he cried out in pain and almost fainted. Butcher decided to return a little bit later when his pulse had recovered, and he was eventually able to produce the bullet. The bullet was later produced in court dramatically to a gasp from the jury, and it was seen to have been compressed where it had gone in, and it was actually stamped with the letters DM of the Dublin Metropolitan Police and a piece of the sergeant's tunic. These events took place just months after the failed Fenian Rising of 1867, and it was believed that the gunman was a Fenian who was on an errand. P.J. Tynan, the reputed number 1 of the Irish Invincibles, later wrote that what actually happened on this night was that there was an informer being held up in Chancery Lane Station. He'd come to give evidence at one of the Crown witness trials. A lot of these Fenians were coming to court in Green Street. Corridan was a hated informer, and he was about to spill the beans on a young doctor called Edmund O'Donovan. Donovan didn't want this to happen, so he arranged a small posse of 8 men who would go and attack the Crown witness barracks with Fenian fire, a kind of incendiary device. In all the confusion and the smoke, they'd find the informer and they'd shoot him. Unfortunately, on the night the shooting happened, one of the men arrived at the rendezvous too early. His wife had given birth to their baby and he missed the time. He stood on the quay, realised his mistake and tried to cross over to the other side, and that is when Keenan met him. Today, this dramatic event is almost forgotten. People pass this junction every day, scarcely giving a moment to realise what unfolded here so many years ago.